Let me go back and do a little commentary about what I heard toward the end, and then from the summaries about what you've been working to. Then I want to stand back and take a much broader look at next gen, the aspirations for it, and you all are key of whether those aspirations can be achieved. The role of government versus the private sector in investing and pushing the frontiers of technology. Industry will spend the money to improve what they're doing, to find new ways to horizontal drilling, fracking. That's opened up a whole new potential world for oil and gas exploration within the country and in many other countries, it turns out. So industry will spend the money if government gives them a little incentive and they can write off a tax thing, that may spur it, but not much, because those are usually year to year, and industry doesn't make its spending decisions on a one-year process. So this extending R&D credits, but doing it at the last minute every year, has minimal value process. On things which enable whole new approaches, industry will not invest. Critical issues for renewable energy, storage and transmission. And industry's not going to fund that. Federal government's going to have to fund. So where I'm headed in that is you need to get pretty specific, not just large general, should government fund or should industry. You need to get down to the technologies and what would they enable over time, and then either you push, you encourage industry to do a consortium, whatever, to pool their resources, give them a little antitrust waiver to encourage them to do that, or government makes the investment to create the technology. And then again, you can encourage industry to take it up a little faster if there are tax incentives. There's a long record for it. I prefer to let the market drive that and not tax incentives over what to do. I just think it's more stable for the long term if the market has decided. As Frank has indicated, I've had a wonderful time these 29 years now in the private sector. And after running a couple of companies, my focus on that side, still up to date, is largely on venture capital investing. And I find over and over again, I have to remind young entrepreneurs, the market hasn't spoken until they pay for the product. And giving it to them as a alpha, a beta test site that they can play with, but they must pay for it, is not market acceptance. And so it's when the product, and so as you're moving the new technology, and I think we have to be fairly hard boiled on a lot of the renewables. Can they in fact achieve market acceptance without subsidies in the process? Or if you have to get a subsidy to get it started, when do you phase out that subsidy and make it stand on its own for the long term in the process? On the energy issues, years to develop, years to deploy, and then if you're lucky, lots of years of paying off for that investment. You really do need to take a 10 to 25-year profile on the issues you want to, how do you, at what pace do you implement them? And then, I guess my last pitch on this one, years ago we began incorporating into, particularly a city like Austin more than any place except California, environmental impact. And in that environmental impact statements for anything you want to build or construct or do. well, where's the economic impact? Every one of these new policy issues ought to have attached to it an analysis of its economic impact. Near term, what do we lose? Long term, what do we gain? And how do you make those trade-offs in a policy sense? And where do you make them? Now, it's that last point, policy, prospects, and the trade-offs, that's at the heart of wanting a vibrant next generation network. Hopefully really proven here and then moved nationally. Two very different things came together. I made a conscious decision when I retired on July '82 from the Navy and the intelligence world to get out of Washington. I wanted to go where I was not on the fringe, still looking at every issue through the lens of how Washington views the problems. I wanted to see, how does the rest of the country think? I've had a lucky, 60 years of adult, repeated lucky adventures. I decided to do the first large-scale joint research venture owned by competing computer and semiconductor companies. And we did a nationwide, open, public site selection process. 57 cities in 27 states bid. Austin happened to win. But the important thing for me, I spent 30 years of my life looking at the outside world. And it was a crash course in looking at economic development in the U.S. It was enormously valuable. It underwrote so many of the things that I have done now over these last 29 years of what I learned in that process about how do you grow businesses, particularly how do you grow new ones? What are the things that the cost of living, the quality of life, the tax climate, the business climate, the public education systems, the transportation systems, air and surface, higher education system, how those all interconnect. So Austin turned out, by good fortune, to be the locale. And I began to re-engage with the university. I graduated UT, the baccalaureate in history, 1950. And re-engaging, getting involved with the campus and with the community, and a lot of issues popped up. And then as I first was adjunct pro bono professor, doing a course cross-listed across business school, public affairs, and law school. And then the dialogue picked up, and finally, 10 years ago, the offer to have the Johnson Chair, the LBJ school. And fairly early in that process, Frank and I got into a dialogue about how do we get a focus on the campus, then in the community, and then in the region on big issues. What role should the U.S. play in the world? We had a driving strategy in the Cold War. And when that went away, nothing replaced it. Everything dealt with tactically as it popped up. And so it was, how can we get, Washington to New York to Boston is filled with organizations, institutions there, in a huge percentage of the cases, either an ideological approach or they know what they want to see done, and they're looking at how to sell it. They're not open for, in most cases, for totally new ideas, because those are counter to what they know needs to be done. So it was okay, get away from that. How do we find the audience mix, and how do we get a dialogue going? And we stumbled. We tried to do one on the Mideast and oil, and relying on faculty and the rest of it, and let's just say we didn't get much in the process. So we then turned to what some of the students had done. And there was a spark. And that grew into a dialogue that led ultimately to broadening our look at international, and became global, and Strauss Center. Now, parallel to that, totally separately, I've been a trustee at American Assembly from shortly after I left government, getting ready to retire. And Richard Fisher came to chair it. And he asked me not to retire, to stay, because he had this idea, getting a foundation to fund, going to try to identify the next generation of leaders across the country, and to get them engaged in what are the big issues, and how do you come together with a consensus on how you ought to deal. First, a consensus on what the issues are, and then a consensus on how you go deal with them. That led to Next Gen, probably the only real contribution I made. They were getting ready to do an executive director to run the program, and I looked at the list of suspects, and they were from Washington or New York or Boston. And so I nominated this entrepreneurial assistant professor named Brett Gavin, and Richard Fisher took him. And it sort of, not only did it take off, and it was overall, like David was saying earlier, it is the most successful program the American Assembly has run since the earlier ones that Eisenhower ran, that laid the basis for his political career, moving into the presidency and doing a great many things to change the country. So the issue then became, okay, the Assembly's role is done. This is not something they do in perpetuity. How can we translate that? And that's where the two ideas came together. Come back, how do you get the dialogue going regionally, not just in Austin, on the process? How do you identify the people to participate in it? How do you get that group to generate the ideas? I've been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations since '78, I guess, and used to be the vice chair of the board. It's a great organization, but it's there only to educate. It's not there to engage. It's not there to say to its members, what ought we to do? What ought the country to do? So I applaud the continuing effort to add to the education, but there's a huge void here. And why I'm now almost evangelical on this issue, I have watched the climate in the country become more toxic for new ideas and for compromise, for consensus in the process. My biggest problem in dealing with the Congress when I was on active duty was to not go up to the Hill after 6 o'clock in the evening, because they were sitting down, Democrats and Republicans together, and opened the bottles. I couldn't, even though I ran around with naval aviators, I couldn't begin to keep up with the consumption level. So I learned not to go at 6 in the evening. I'd go in noontime or in the morning and get good dialogues. They don't get together to drink at night or for any other purpose. They used to all get together on weekends. My family would be included to go and do something with them. Families stay mostly in the home districts. They go in on Tuesday morning, they go home on Thursday night. There are no dialogues, social interactions, talking about issues out of shouting. So Washington, far less than in my era, is the place to let new ideas get massaged, developed, and finally exposed to the public. So this is a big challenge to toss out to, but essentially what I hope you're going to be are role models here. And that means you need to be constantly on the lookout for who are other people who would broaden, who would bring something else that you don't now have in this group. We benefited from that in the initial Next Gens as we moved to each of the areas for the regional meetings, and additional people were identified and brought into. So that needs to be a constant process. 5 years from now, as you've become really good at this and are tossing up some very interesting things to try to shape the political debate and decisions on the part of the country, will come, okay, who are those 5 years younger than you are? That ought to be pulled in. The interns, and maybe even earlier than that, identifying some who might come as interns, not members yet. They need a little maturity, a little age, that process, but interns. So that's the broad conceptual framework for why next gen. There's a void here. I invite you to go. Maybe I'm missing some things. I'm sorry, blogs on the internet do not fill this need. First, nobody's challenging what they're saying in most cases or their view. And it's this interaction among you and sort of not being reluctant, politely, civilly, but challenge the things that pop up. Make people refine and better define their ideas. They'll be better out of that process. I don't think there's a substitute for at least occasionally these being face-to-face meetings. I think you can do a lot online, and to define the ideas you want to pursue, to do research, to get people to commit to doing different research, to begin to flow things in. But I think it's the interaction when you're sitting down in the groups that let you move it from ideas to potentially practical solutions to problems. And that's what the country desperately needs. You will probably already have inferred, I'm a political independent. I have fought pretty fiercely to keep that independence over these last 29 years. Occasionally it's been strained. Right now it's not strained at all, being politically independent. But I feel I've been abandoned as the major parties have moved toward their fringes. I don't propose to go out and reform the parties. I hope in due course there'll be some natural movement back toward the center. But I think how that's most likely to occur is if there are attractive policy options that are floated that the public at large says, those are good ideas. What are you going to do about it in the process? That will be more likely to move the parties back rather than having, I better stay out of trouble on which particular problems might touch me off. Long-winded way of saying, you're filling a void. I believe that that void desperately needs bright people who are willing to commit time, energy, intellect to coming up with solutions for the country's largest problems. And I hope you'll feel challenged to do that. And with that, thus endeth the sermon. I think the reception's about due to start. I would take maybe 5 minutes if anybody specifically wants to fire a question. Yes?
I kind of feel like we've lost the national security argument
Yeah.
on energy. You know, it was very strong in the 1970s, and every president said, we've got to get off oil now. Why is that?
No overarching strategy for national security into which you fit what is the role of energy in that process. Mike Mullen, I think, is going to get good high marks for his service for 4 years as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Took some controversial stands, right? But he was very direct last year to say the #1 national security problem is the economy. If you don't have a vibrant economy, you cannot finance all the things you need to do to be preeminent in the national security arena. And energy clearly plays a role I'm wildly enthusiastic about the ability to develop, even though I was in the coal business for a while, natural gas, because it's far cleaner. It's an interim step maybe, but at least potentially available in large quantities to get the pipelines and all those other things that you need to be able to transmit. That development and the Canadian oil sand, huge environmental issues developing it. But when you look at the dramatic impact that could have on reducing our dependence on the Persian Gulf, on Venezuela, and the freedom it gives us to stand back and say, for all those issues, are those in our national interest? Are they ones that we are concerned about on a larger scale? So energy independence for North America, to me, goes a very long way toward giving us much more freedom for positions we take in other parts of the world, where we decide to get involved. But you give me long enough on this, I'll get it around to getting you to develop for me what role should the U.S. play in the world. But I think that underlies a lot of energy in the national security aspect. Yes?
Yeah, we spent some time today talking about the need to internalize the costs of some of the societal externalities from fossil fuels. And
Yeah.
you mentioned your role in the coal industry. You were on the board of Massey, which of course had the government said was responsible for the deaths of 29 workers. Also was involved in mountaintop removal mining, which is seriously polluted out black streams. And so my question is, what's your view on the need to internalize those costs, and has that changed through your experience?
The reality is that almost half the electrical energy consumed is produced by coal. You've got two alternatives. You can shut down those industries that are using it and give up a huge amount of jobs, or you can find alternatives. Third alternative is clean coal. Science is not there yet to make that, for me, a viable option. You saw there's one thing that's being undertaken now, it's by Duke Energy, I think, and it just grew from 2 billion to 3 billion just to finish that and proof of concept. Hard for industry to be able to afford and take on that sort of cost. But it's part of my enthusiasm for natural gas, is that offers a far faster replacement for producing that power at comparable or lower cost. Your biggest problem is transmission and conversion, and with clearly less impact on the environment. I had a very bright young woman, student, 12 years ago, who focused on research. She was concerned about environmental issues in Mexico. And how could you deal with those and elevate their concerns with it? So she did a study all over the globe, different countries and the policies they took, and at what point did they move up $4,000 equivalent average income was the break point. If it was very low, it was food, shelter, clothing. A little higher was education, housing. You crossed over 4,000 and they were suddenly concerned about the world around them and willing to invest in environmental issues. So you come back to, for many of these, and how do you gain things? It's how you bring up the overall standard of living, cost of living, is where you get the encouragement to then eliminate some approaches and elevate others which serve your environmental purposes. If you're giving up jobs in that process when you're already in a very tough climate, it's not a positive trend. Yes, sir.
With the current toxic nature of Congress and your assessment that they're not accepting new ideas, what role do you believe we as the Next Generation Project will play? Is it to become more educators of the consumer or public, or those that continue to share our ideas with Congress for those that they come around?
My sense here is that have to be very careful that the ideas are being developed without a preconceived party or political alignment. I had a wonderful boss many, many years ago who saw a burst of anger on my part when I was 28. And he sat me down to give me his theory of the conservation of enemies. When you felt yourself starting to get angry, stop for a moment. Say, is this a matter of principle? If it was, deliver blows they'd remember and be reluctant to fight you on a matter of principle. But if you couldn't say with certainty it was a matter of principle, set it aside. Come back to it, set it aside. 10 times, you'd either find a solution or you decide it wasn't that important. Corollary was, when you have a new idea, and that's what this one's all about, when you got a new idea, stop for a moment and say, who might be opposed to that? And figure out how you either co-opt them or go around them. And that's why my sense in this polarized political environment, it's far better to focus on developing the issues, developing proposed solutions, and floating those into the political environment, rather than trying to take on the political role. Now, if some of you who get so enthused with these, and you also want to go run for public office, I'll break out my checkbook and write a small check along the way. Okay? Should we let them go? Okay, thank you all very much.